Mr. President, I rise today to move for the establishment of a select committee to inquire into the circumstances surrounding the government's decision to scrap the social worker registration scheme, a scheme that was years in the making, a scheme that saw $4.6 out of $4.7 million commitment spent and a board appointed. A scheme that followed a recommendation from a coronial inquest into the tragic death of little Chloe Valentine. Many were gobsmacked when they realised that the government had made the decision to scrap this scheme. And since that announcement, I think that it is fair to say that there have been more questions than there have been answers. The Budget and Finance Committee heard from the Chief Executive of the Department for Child Protection that no advice was requested from the department, either by Minister Hilliard or now Minister Rolls, about the cancellation prior to its decision. Not only did the minister not consult her own department on the cancellation, but she also did not consult the board from that very scheme about their views on the cancellation. If this minister did not make the decision at the advice of the department or the board, then whose advice did she take? Or is it the government's position that a brand new MP made the decision to scrap a $4.6 million scheme that was recommended by a coronial inquest only about 3 months into her role? Because if that is the case, Mr. President, that really is quite extraordinary. The government used the cost of registration fees as a key justification for scrapping this scheme. We even saw the Minister and the Premier give conflicting figures for what the registration fee would have been. This is despite the Minister initially saying that there was no fee finalised. We were later told by the Chief Executive that the proposed fee structure was still being worked through and that there was no final decision made. So you would think, Mr. President, you would think that if this was one of the key recommendations as to why this government decided to scrap a $4.6 million scheme, that they would have known what the exact figure was. Despite the minister raising the cost of living as a key concern, as one of the key justifications to scrap this scheme, the Chief Executive advised the Budget and Finance Committee that at no point did the minister ask if there were any ways in which the cost imposed on social workers could have been reduced. So, I'm left here scratching my head. I'm wondering why, if the cost of living pressures were of such concern, why was the department not asked for these measures before the minister made the drastic and the very costly decision to scrap the scheme? The government has said that they want to see a national scheme. Yet we have heard from the Chief Executive of the Department for Child Protection that the department was not involved with the federal government to roll out a scheme. In fact, when asked whether, to her knowledge, the federal government has committed to any formal consultation to date for a national model to be rolled out, the Chief Executive said no. Now, I understand that the minister's spoken to the federal government about this matter. Great, but that seems to be pretty well the extent of it at this point. But of course, we know that a push for a national model is not new. In fact, to quote the Honourable Claire Scriven during the second reading of the bill when this scheme was first established, she said, and I quote, Mr. President, "This bill has been a long time coming. For close to 2 decades, I am advised, social workers have been advocating for professional recognition and registration. Our former colleague, the Honourable Jack Snelling, in the other place worked hard to advocate for the establishment of a national model for many years, but was unfortunately unsuccessful during his tenure as Health Minister." The Honourable Ms Scriven goes on to say that a national model of registration through a body such as APRA would be the most ideal outcome, but even after 20+ years of advocacy for professional social workers, we are still waiting for a national register to be adopted. So it's now up to us as a state level to pass this legislation as the next best thing. It's time for South Australia to lead the way. So it's confusing then, Mr. President, to understand why the government would go from saying that South Australia must lead the way, something that we all know that the Premier is no stranger to saying, that South Australia needs to be nation leading, to now all of a sudden be walking away from a scheme that they've previously championed, that they've spent $4.6 million on, that they've appointed a board for, spent years developing, and even the chief executive of the own DCP department has admitted that the scheme was ready to go. So I am again left here scratching my head. Why was this scheme scrapped? When was a decision made? Who ultimately has made this decision? Because it clearly was not at the advice of the department. Is it the situation that a brand new novice MP minister made a decision to scrap a $4.6 million scheme on her own? Because if that is the case, Mr. President, that is pretty extraordinary. So fast forward around 2 months since the government's announcement, and here we are, with more questions than we have answers, which is why I am moving to establish this select committee today. To be clear, it's not my intention that this parliamentary committee look to rerun the debate about whether the social worker registration scheme should exist and whether or not social workers should be registered, and if so, in what format. The move to establish a select committee is about transparency and it's about accountability in the government's decision to scrap this scheme. The Parliament and the public frankly deserve to know exactly what has happened. Following the evidence given to Budget and Finance Committee, I believe that that question has become considerably more important. The central question is, how did the government get from having a legislated scheme, a dedicated board and a $4.7 million budget, and a scheme that the chief executive has even said was ready to go, to all of a sudden cancelling the scheme altogether? Importantly, was that decision made transparently, on the basis of proper advice and with proper considerable alternatives? Critically, what advice did the government receive before making its decision, or did they not receive any advice at all? These questions matter because transparency matters. South Australians deserve to know exactly what happened when this government made the decision to throw $4.6 million in a scrap heap. A select committee has the ability to answer those questions. Governments cannot reasonably expect the Parliament to appropriate millions of dollars for a reform to establish such a scheme and employ staff to implement it, and then several years later to simply announce that the reform is being abandoned without the Parliament having a proper opportunity to understand the decision-making process, meanwhile being told by the department's own chief executive that it was ready to go. This is particularly important when the policy was developed in response to a recommendation arising from serious child protection failures. The registration scheme did not emerge from nowhere. The establishment of a social worker registration scheme was a recommendation from the State Coroner's inquest into the tragic death of little 4-year-old Chloe Valentine. And I think, Mr. President, you would be really hard-pressed to find a household who doesn't know the name and the face of little Chloe Valentine. Chloe sadly died in 2012 following repeated involvement with the Department for Child Protection. Disappointingly, Chloe's grandmother, Belinda, was not consulted, nor was she even told that the government was walking away from this scheme, despite it stemming from her granddaughter's coronial inquest. I think it shows a real misstep, and I think it shows a real lack of respect for Chloe's family from this government, that they weren't given, at the absolute minimum, forewarning of the government's decision to walk away from this scheme. I've had the privilege of speaking with Belinda about the social worker registration scheme, and I've watched her continue to advocate for Chloe's legacy, and I've watched her continue to advocate for vulnerable South Australian children. And quite frankly, I think that Belinda's strength is admirable. I don't know how she does it. So in closing, Mr. President, I would like to share with the chamber a quote from Belinda that she gave the ABC in her advocacy for her granddaughter Chloe's legacy. I think it's an important reminder that social workers do incredibly important work within our community, but ultimately at the end of the day, they are dealing with our state's most vulnerable. Belinda's words in speaking about the cancellation of this scheme are a reminder for us all about what is ultimately at stake And it's my view that we as parliamentarians cannot afford to get this wrong. Belinda said, and I quote, "But the biggest betrayal is to the kids in our state who suffer in silence and who are the ones who ultimately face the consequences of decisions like these." That right there, Mr. President, is the crux of why we need transparency around this government's decision to scrap this scheme. And with that, Mr. President, I commend the motion.